Brandon Combs, the head of the Firearms Policy Coalition, has just published in the Washington Times an excellent op-ed calling for several things to be done by the Trump administration, in particular, basically recommending the appointment of a Second Amendment czar or a gun czar, something that we've talked about on this channel before, and we really do support. This is an important position that someone in the Trump administration should take on or should be appointed to. Let's talk about exactly what a Second Amendment czar for the Trump administration might do, and frankly, in my view, should do. Let's talk about it. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Nine, a proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, so this is an important idea, very important idea. This is the notion that President Trump and Pam Bondi, the Department of Justice, should work together to appoint a single person to oversee Second Amendment policy or to be actively involved in terms of setting Second Amendment agenda items and gun-related policies. Now, this could be done in several different ways, which we'll get to in a moment in terms of how one might structure the position. But the reality is the idea itself is sound. And I just want to, for the purposes of this video, talk about if I, for example, were the gun czar or the Second Amendment czar, here are the things that I would say off the top of my head should be done almost on a daily basis by that person. And again, I'm going to put a link to the Washington Times article by Brandon Combs, the head of that most excellent organization, the Firearms Policy Coalition, does a lot of litigation all around the country fighting for our right to keep and bear arms. I'll put a link to the article down below so you can check it out and see if you disagree with anything that I'm saying here. But to begin with, he specifically argues that there should be some sort of a Second Amendment czar. So what I'm going to do is I'll give you what Brandon Combs says in just one moment, and then we're going to talk about the details of what exactly that person should be doing if they're appointed. And then at the very end, I'll spend just maybe a few minutes, not even a few minutes, just maybe 1 minute, talking about how one in the Department of Justice or in the White House could possibly structure the position. So to begin with, this is what Brandon Combs, the head of the Firearms Policy Coalition, had to say about the appointment of a Second Amendment czar, in his article for the Washington Times. The first order of business should be the appointment of a Second Amendment czar, a dedicated official within the White House or Justice Department responsible for overseeing and advocating for policies that protect the right to keep and bear arms. This role would serve as a critical liaison among governmental departments, firearm owners, and advocacy organizations with a specialized understanding of strategy, law, and history to ensure concerns are appropriately and consistently addressed at the highest levels. I wholeheartedly agree with the idea. So let's talk specifics about what this job might entail. And if I were in this position, exactly what I would be doing, what I would be looking for. I think there's basically 7 areas, generally speaking. Again, you can come up with more, you can break it down in different ways, but as I see it, there's seven buckets of work that would need to be done. Again, there's different ways to break it down, but this is how I see it. Number one, first and foremost, 100% the most important thing is to monitor ongoing litigation across the country, both in federal courts and state courts, but with a particular emphasis on anything involving the United States Department of Justice and any federal cases involving federal statutes, for example. So, for example, this person would be involved in making decisions as to what the Trump administration would do with respect to whether or not to seek cert from the United States Supreme Court in cases like the Bryan Range case out of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, covering New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Also whether or not, and that is the nonviolent felon case. Also whether or not to seek cert in the Reese case out of the Fifth Circuit, which covers Mississippi, Texas, and Louisiana. And the Reese case specifically deals with that absurd federal law that says that 18, 19, and 20-year-olds are perfectly able to buy handguns from their buddy out of the back of a vehicle on a street corner or on a dark alley, but they're not legally under federal law able to buy a handgun from an FFL, from a licensed gun dealer. This is absurd, and that's the Reese case. The Fifth Circuit said was unconstitutional. So again, as I've said before, in cases like that, the Department of Justice under Donald Trump should seek cert in both the Range case and the Reese case, and they should tell the Supreme Court they intend to continue to enforce these laws, making sure they're still standing in a case of controversy so you don't have a mootness problem, and at the same time argue, once cert is granted, that they think that actually the Second Amendment should prevail and that the federal government law does indeed violate the Constitution. Again, it's not just those cases, but those are the kinds of things that every single litigation in the United States where the United States Department of Justice is filing a brief all the way down to the district court level, and that could be in any of these cases across the United States, both involving the ATF and the Second Amendment and anything else, this person would be able to review those briefs and submissions before they're filed to see whether or not there's a potential problem with taking a position in any of those cases, not just in the U.S. Courts of Appeals, but also in the district courts. They would be the one person that every single lawyer at the Department of Justice would have to run a brief by, to the extent a legal filing, a legal brief, a complaint, an indictment touches fingers with firearms or the Second Amendment. That would be number one, to make sure that the litigation posture, and it's not just that the positions are correct, that they're arguing in favor of the Second Amendment, but the way they're arguing about it, the proper methodology under Bruin is also being followed, and to the extent it's an arms ban case, that they follow the methodology articulated in Heller, which is really just basically Bruin, except Bruin is for sippy cup, paint by numbers, really a version of Heller, except Bruin again just lays out in more detail because the inferior courts kept screwing up the Heller decision. So that's the first thing that any kind of a Second Amendment czar should do. They should laser focus on making sure that all litigation involving the Second Amendment, guns, and the Department of Justice is lined up properly under a proper and correct understanding of the Second Amendment to make sure that Americans' rights are not being violated. I think the second thing that the Second Amendment czar would be doing would be to serve as a public liaison with the Second Amendment community and anybody who's interested in the Second Amendment gun-related items. This is what Brandon Combs does flag in his article in the Washington Times. And basically, this is what I would do if I were in this role. I would basically be looking at X. I'd be looking at any legal blogs. I'd be looking at all kind of the publications by the various gun-related organizations. I would look not just at the kind of the pro-gun side. If you want, I'd actually look to see what the anti-gunners are doing as well. I'd be reading all the publications of all the major groups in this area, and also newspaper articles that come out about guns, Second Amendment, whatever it is. I'd be paying attention to this, as well as law review articles and scholarship. So basically, I would constantly be looking all across the literature and also interacting either on X or in phone calls or meetings, whatever it is. I would be interacting with the American public, which I think is appropriate in terms of making sure that what you're doing is consistent with what was voted for. And I would basically be keeping my finger on the pulse of the Second Amendment community to see if there's some screw up. So, for example, we've talked on this channel before, my joke about Paul Blart Mall Cop, that movie from many years ago that says, you're supposed to observe and report if you see something crazy or to see something, say something, right? And I've explained that the Second Amendment community should be seeing something and saying something that they see something that's a little untoward. So if you see a potentially unjust prosecution, which there's some examples of out there, I don't need to name them right now, but there are some examples of there out there. Those get flagged and those get referred to the administration because, again, if they don't know about it, they can't do anything about it. And as I've explained to you before, historically, if you talk to older people that used to work for the NRA, I've had some friends that have worked there many years ago. I haven't talked to them in a while, but they used to work there. And they would always tell me when I would occasionally speak with them the following. They say, look, we can track legislation all across the country. We at the NRA know kind of what's going on legislatively in Capitol Hill, Congress. We know all that stuff. But what we don't know are all the lawsuits that are going on across the country. So if you have some criminal defense lawyer, let's say in the Southern District of Washington or somewhere, or the Northern District of Oregon, or some state court, in Maine, making some Second Amendment argument, that's the sort of thing that the NRA and gun rights groups might not know about, because it's like, how would you know? There's tens of thousands of cases every year. You're not going to know them all. And the benefit in the modern era, of course, right now is if people see Second Amendment related stuff in some small town in the middle of Wyoming or whatever, that can be flagged and brought to people's attention by the internet, by social media, by reaching out to gun rights groups, by speaking to, YouTube influencers. There's a lot of great ones out there, and, let people know. And this was something that was not available 20 years ago. Right now, of course, if you see something weird, you can alert the Second Amendment community almost in an instant. And that, of course, is something I think that the Second Amendment czar should be interacting with all this sort of interface going on to see if there's something that's occurring or some agenda item that's arising that's inconsistent with the Trump policy. So that's what the Second Amendment czar would do in terms of being a public liaison, not just with the Second Amendment community, but any scholarship, influencer community, whatever it is. They would basically have their finger on the pulse of the Second Amendment and gun-related world to identify any stories or any other issues that might pop up. And again, we did see this in a related example where there was a New Hampshire case dealing with protests by parents about transgender boys playing in girls' sports and all that. And that got the attention of the administration really quick. So again, it is clearly something that the administration is looking at is social media. So again, I would keep that in mind moving forward, and that would be the job of a Second Amendment czar to look at these kinds of things and flag them for the administration. I think the third thing, of course, is monitoring very carefully the ATF to make sure any public statement the ATF makes, any issues they send out, if they write letters about classification of firearms that look squirrely or anything like that, they would be on top of this and basically monitoring the ATF in all respects. And I think on a related note, and this is kind of point number 4, but it's related to number 3, is that they would monitor very carefully and they would bring members of the Doge team with them to that West Virginia warehouse that the ATF has been storing the 4473s. And if I were doing this, I would bring a member of Doge, a computer expert out of the Doge team, with me to the ATF specifically, and specifically to that warehouse in West Virginia of the ATF. And I would look extremely carefully all across at every computer to make sure there is no attempt to digitize illegally the 4473s, gun owner list, gun list, anything like this, because if they were to do so, that would almost certainly violate federal law. I think that you cannot compile these registries under the Firearms Owners Protection Act. I think you cannot compile these registries under the relevant NICS system laws arising from the Brady Act, and so on and so on. We can do a separate video about this. We've done it before, but we can always do another. You can't do a gun registry under federal law. Maybe I probably need to do that, but the bottom line is you can't do it. And I would bring somebody from Doge over to the ATF and anywhere else I thought that they might be compiling these kinds of illegal lists, and I'd have them do a search and try to track that stuff down and make sure to the extent anything is being digitized that should not be, that would be destroyed, because that would be illegal under federal law. And that would be really my 4th point. Number 3 is ATF monitoring, and my 4th point would be really monitoring the attempt to digitize and create illegal gun registries or gun owner registries in the United States using the federal government would be kind of my 4th point. And that gives rise to the 5th thing that I think the Second Amendment czar should be doing, or would do if ever appointed, and that is they should be monitoring the deep state in all respects. And what I mean by this is if you see attempts by the deep state, if you see attempts by the CDC, by the Department of Public Health, whatever, by the Department of Health and Human Services, any of these organizations to try to declare gun violence an epidemic or some other nonsense, you see them trying to put out studies that indicate that guns are terrible, or any other of these nonsensical studies that you see sometimes, I would make sure that you would have the authority to review these before they're published in any respect, to make sure that whatever is being published is accurate, correct, and done robustly according to Hoyle before anything gets published. Because again, there is certainly no shortage of junk science out there in American life. And I would say one of the Second Amendment czar's jobs would be to ensure there is no junk science published with a political propaganda and angle to attack the rights of gun owners, which we have seen in the past. And of course, to the extent there's any attempt by the deep state, any agency to remove defensive gun use statistics, which I think we saw in the Biden era, right, involving, I think, some data involving Gary Kleck. I think that was removed from the public websites. Anything like that that's an attempt to remove favorable information about the Second Amendment, favorable information about guns from the public sphere, from the government websites by some deep state actor, that would be flagged immediately. And again, that would be a big thing, because a lot of things the deep state do or can do could impact our right to keep and bear arms in a big way. So, for example, if there's grants being given to organizations that are known for being anti-gun, that would be the sort of thing that a Second Amendment czar would help flag. And this, again, would be kind of what I would call the fifth bucket of things that the czar should be doing, which is monitoring the deep state in all respects, all aspects of federal agencies, to see if they're doing something nonsensical and violative of our right to keep and bear arms, or to create propaganda against our Constitution. I'd be looking for that very, very carefully. The sixth thing here is I would involve myself with anything involving the Freedom of Information Act to the extent there are requests about communications or emails or whatever associated with the Joe Biden Office of Gun Violence, or any of these communications between gun control groups and the Biden administration, for example. I would be looking very carefully to get that information revealed to the public, obviously under FOIA laws. I think that would be appropriate. And that is exactly what I would be doing if I were a Second Amendment czar, or whoever that person was, would be sort of doing that to see if there's specific requests that should be revealed, to disclosed. Those should be turned over so the American public can assess it in the normal course and not hide some of this nonsense that has been going on in the past. And the seventh bucket, I would say, the last bucket, but not the least, not least important, but an equally important bucket to the other things. Bucket number 7 is, to the extent there are federal judges that are being considered, whether at the U.S. Supreme Court level, of course, or the U.S. Court of Appeals levels, or even the district court levels, I would be, or the Second Amendment czar would be involved, in my opinion, with vetting those judges from the perspective of the Second Amendment. So if they've said something problematic about the Second Amendment, they've come out with a terrible ruling that did not follow Bruin, let's say, or any of these sorts of things, you, as the Second Amendment czar, would flag that and bring that to the attention of probably the White House counsel's office, who I'm guessing would ultimately be responsible for vetting that particular judge or those judges or whatever it is. So again, those are the seven items that I would be focused on, or I think a Second Amendment czar should be focused on if appointed. Monitoring all litigations, the public liaison with the public and the Second Amendment community, monitoring the ATF, focused on that ATF warehouse in West Virginia. Number 5, of course, is monitoring the whole deep state for anti-gun agenda items. Number 6 is dealing with any FOIA requests involving guns in the Biden administration. And number 7, vetting potential future federal judges for their positions on the right to keep and bear arms, to make sure it's all consistent. And as to how one might go about doing this, I'm not an expert on the Plum Book or anything like this, but I think this could be done a bunch of different ways. I think there could be appointment as part of the White House counsel's office as a counselor to the president. I think they could be appointed by the Department of Justice and assigned to the White House for this role. But whatever the job is, whether it be at the White House, at the Justice Department, or a combination of the two, they have to have the authority, the clear authority and the gravitas necessary to pick up the phone and call up government lawyers and government agents and tell them that they speak on behalf of the White House and the President and the Attorney General, and they better not file that document, they better not take that position or whatever it is, and that people will listen. And if the people file positions in court that are not consistent with the Trump agenda and the proper way to interpret the Second Amendment, there will be a subsequent filing that would be most embarrassing to whoever made that for initial submission. So again, there you have it. I think it's a great idea from Brandon Combs, who did a good job explaining this in the Washington Times. And again, I thank you all for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. Make sure you follow me at X at 4 Boxes Diner. And I look forward to talking to you all again very, very soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.